So we've talked about how to determine parallel, perpendicular, and either. But in those cases, when we were talking about parallel, perpendicular, and either, we didn't have equations. We actually had either giving you two slopes, or we had asked you from an ordered pairs to find the slope. And then from the ordered pairs, when you find the slope, you compare the two slopes. What happens if we don't give you ordered pairs, or we don't tell you what the slope is, but we give you equations? That's what this is talking about in 3.4. So this one's going to be a multiple choice question because it's either parallel, perpendicular, and either. They're going to give you two equations. Here we have line 1, and here we have line 2. The first thing you want to do is, just like we did in the other problems, you want to find the slope of the equation by getting y by itself. So if you forgot, or you need to look at the steps of how I do this, let's take a look. Determine parallel, perpendicular, and either. Give an equation. You're going to take each equation and you have to get the y by itself. Remember, solve for the specified variable y. Because when you have y by itself, step 2 says you can find the slope of each equation by just remembering y equals mx plus b. See how y is by itself? Then whatever the coefficient of x is, remember m is slope. So all we need to do is get y by itself, find the coefficient of x, that's your slope. Now, once you do that for both equations, we have to compare the slopes, just like we've been doing with the other parallel, perpendicular, and either. If the slopes are identical, same sign, same number, you stop and you say you have parallel lines, you're done. If the two are not identical, they're different, then we told you we're going to multiply the slopes together. Okay? So you're going to have two slopes, multiply the two together. Then you're going to look at that answer. If the answer or product is -1, then we can stop. We can say you have perpendicular lines. If you get any other answer, okay, so you don't get -1, you get -2, you get 2/3, you get 7, then we told you if you don't get -1, then that's when you say neither. And just remember, when you're finding slope up here, you're always going to have to reduce your slope. Because I know I have some people who might get a slope of 2/4, 2/4, and then someone else gets a slope of 1/2 for the other equation, and they say, well, 2/4 and 1/2, they're not identical. Well, yeah, they are identical, because 2/4 is supposed to have been reduced. And when you reduce that, that's 1/2. So if you get one slope as 1/2 and the other slope as 1/2, you can see that's identical. That would be parallel. So some people don't reduce their slopes and make a mistake. But you see 2/4, you gotta remember that reduces down to 1/2. Okay, so now that we know our goal is just to get y by itself so that we can grab the coefficient of x and then compare those two slopes, let's work on line 1. Line 1, you can see, definitely not by itself. Remember, we're trying to get the letter y by itself. So if it's not by itself, remember, we have a left and a right-hand side. What you want to do is see if there's anything added or subtracted to the underlying y. See how this 6x is added? So we have to move. The opposite of a positive 6x would be a negative 6x. Remember, it's the opposite of what this is. So that's a positive, the opposite would be a negative. Whatever you do on one side, you have to do to the other. These cancel out, so you're left with a positive 2y. Now over here, constant, coefficient, variable, nothing matches. So put the x term first. Put this constant, which is a positive 10 at the end. Make sure you put plus to separate the variable from the constant. Now we need to get the y by itself. See how it has a coefficient? So we're going to divide this by 2. And since there's 2 items here, you're going to divide both items by 2. Okay? Terms are separated by addition or subtraction signs. So this is one term, this is your second term. That's why there's 2 2's here. So 2 divided by 2, you know that can reduce down to just y. And over here, negative 6x divided by 2, that's going to be negative 3x. Remember, this divides out evenly. Because this divides out evenly, and this x is on top, you could slide the x over and just say negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3 with the x on the side. And over here, 10 divided by 2 is going to be positive 5. So here, we can see slope of the first line is negative 3. Remember, it's the coefficient of x. Let's see what this line 2 is going to give us. So hopefully I can squeeze it on here. If not, we might have to erase. X plus 8y equals 48. We want to get y by itself. You can clearly see y is definitely not by itself. So we got to move anything that's added or subtracted. See how this x is added to the underline? So the x term has to move. Since x is positive, the opposite, additive inverse, is a negative x. Remember, whatever do to the left, you have to do to the right. They cancel out. So I'm left with positive 8y. Now, constant, variable, don't smush. You have to put them as separate terms. So the variable one first, negative x, and then the constant goes last. Since this is positive, put it as plus 48. Now we want to get y by itself, so we want to get rid of this coefficient of 8. So divide both sides by 8. So 8 divided by 8, they cancel out. So we get y equals. Now here, there's no number in front. Remember, if there's no number in front, there's an understood 1. So negative 1 divided by 8, if you put that in your calculator, you're going to get that 0.125. That you cannot have. You have to keep this as a fraction. So negative divided by positive is going to be a negative 1 over 8, because we can't reduce. 1 you can't break down any further. So if we can't break down 1, 8, even though I can break it down as 2, 2, 2, nothing cancels out. Now since the x is on top, we said we can slide it over. And then over here, positive 48 divided by 8 is going to be positive 6. Now, y is by itself, so now we can actually grab the coefficient of x. So for our other equation, we found out the slope is negative 1/8. Negative 3 versus a negative 1/8. Okay, compare. Are they identical? Not at all. One's a fraction, one's a whole number. So right off the bat, not parallel. So you can multiply the two. If you multiply negative 3 times negative 1/8, remember, to multiply with a fraction, you have to have everything written as a fraction. So negative times negative, we know that's going to be a positive. 3 times 1 is 3. 1 times 8 is 8. That's not a negative 1. So we didn't get identical, and we don't get negative 1 when I multiply the two. So this guy is actually going to be neither. Remember, to be parallel, to choose that, these had to be exactly the same. To be perpendicular, these two would have to be opposite signs. You can see they're not opposite signs. And they would have to be reciprocal of each other. And if you flip negative 1/8 over, that would be 8, not a 3. So that's the reason why we say neither. So just make sure you remember that. Okay? If the slopes are identical, parallel lines. If the slopes are different, multiply them. If you get negative 1, you can call them perpendicular. If you get any other number, then you say it's neither. Okay? So ours is neither.